At the turn of the 20th century, Belorussia was a very underdeveloped part of Europe, with a stratified social system and an economy that was predominantly agrarian. In 1905, 63% of the Belarusian population was illiterate, making it the least literate of all the European regions in the Russian Empire. With the help of Russian Marxist circles, the Belarusian peasantry organized at the beginning of the 20th century and carried out actions against the state. However, revolutionary activity did not have a nationalist nature due to a strongly anti-nationalist policy for most of the Tsarist period. It was only by 1905, with the rise of the Belarusian Socialist Hromada, an early radical leftist party, that the incorporation and development of a national identity for Belorussia became a central part to opposing the imperial order. The BSH ran their platform in opposition to Russian imperial rule and the Polish gentry's control of Belarusian land, thus joining the values of self-determination with leftist values of lower-class emancipation. Despite the beginning of Belarusian resistance to Russian rule, the national movement was overshadowed by the larger anti-Tsarist action rippling through the empire. In the early years of the revolutionary period, the Bolshevik ranks, though growing considerably in number, did not include many Belarusian people. Indeed, most of the Belarusian nationalist activity centered around support for the provisional government, and the hope that Belorussia could be an autonomous part of a democratic federation of republics coming out of an imperial structure. This, of course, did not sit well with the Bolsheviks, who saw the provisional government as a bourgeois entity, and the February Revolution as only a halfway point to the ultimate political goal, proletarian revolution. The complete end of the Great War marked a considerable turn in Bolshevik policy towards Belorussia. They realized their rejection and outright repression of Belarusian nationalism was antithetical to the values they espoused in public. This acknowledgement led to a complete reversal in Bolshevik action regarding Belarusian nationalism. The opening of institutions like the Belarusian People's University in Moscow, and the invitation of Belarusian cultural experts to Moscow symbolized the beginning of a new attitude towards Belorussia as a national entity. Unfortunately, not too long after the landmark establishment of the Belarusian SSR, orders came from Moscow that ensured 4 out of 5 Belarusian provinces would be subsumed into the RSFSR, and that the Minsk province would become part of Litbel, a union of Lithuania and Belorussia. In other words, despite the establishment of a Belarusian republic, Moscow was still calling the shots. Poland's invasion of its historic territories in 1919 further complicated Belorussia's already tenuous national position. In the very beginning, the Poles marched eastward under the banner of national liberation and self-determination. But the actions and rhetoric of the Polish government changed quickly, and it became all too clear that Poland was seeking to incorporate Belorussia and a slew of other eastern states. Additional Polish forces were sent to the front with the consent of the Allies, allowing the Poles to push the Bolsheviks out of Minsk. This began the period of Polish occupation, which was notorious for the hardship the Belarusians suffered under Polish rule. The Poles were in some cases inexplicably brutal, and were known to burn entire villages to the ground with little justification. For a while, the Poles were able to keep pushing back Bolshevik troops, but after the Red Army dealt its final blows to the Whites, priorities were redirected to dealing with Poland. It took the Red Army less than a month to take back all of Belorussia. The Polish-Soviet War ended with the Treaty of Riga, which, in typical great power fashion, divided Belorussia among the two countries with no input or consent from the Belarusian people. Split into 3 parts, some 40,000 square miles of western territory went to Poland, while the eastern lands were given to the RSFSR. Only a small portion of central districts, a total of 6 all around Minsk, were given to the Belarusian SSR. The period that followed constituted a constant fluctuation in policy regarding Belorussia's position in the Union. In some years, the Belarusian SSR saw encouragement and expansion of liberties from Moscow. Other years were marked by repression and Russification. Belorussia was pulled back and forth by changing central policies that seemed to be reconciling their own contradictions. As a result, the formation of Belarusian national identity in the Soviet era was not a smooth or homogeneous process. Understanding why the BSSR went through such changes requires a brief analysis of Soviet nationality policy at its core. The fundamental strain in Soviet nationality policy rested on the contradicting values of applied Marxist theory and the lingering ideology of the old order. Moreover, the ideology of the Old World enjoyed the support of the very material conditions the young Soviet state inherited, namely the existing social, moral, intellectual, political, and even economic structures that were left exposed after the Tsarist framework crumbled around them. Factories, for example, were not transformed overnight into socialist workplaces. Similarly, old views, conservative, and even reactionary tendencies were deeply ingrained in many segments of the population. Marx himself wrote about the infant stages of development in a new social system, pointing out that old realities did not die overnight, nor did the new system appear into the world entirely matured and categorically distinct from its predecessor. On the contrary, the new system is stamped with the birthmarks of the old order. Such circumstances played out clearly for the emerging Soviet state in a global system that did not cease to be oriented around a relative power paradigm that necessitated self-serving and self-preserving action on the part of every sovereign entity for its own survival. Posing a direct ideological and strategic threat to older powers, the Soviet Union was especially caught up in the drive to acquire territory as a buffer for the perceived aggression of foreign interests. Though they did not need concrete justification for their expansive policies, the Soviets certainly did receive on numerous occasions ample reasons to maintain tight control of peripheral republics and territories. From the intervention of Allied powers in the Civil War, to the German invasion 2 decades later, to the American policy of containment, the Soviet spheres were constantly reconstructed. Thus, it comes as no surprise that Moscow rarely considered granting the other republics de facto autonomy. Such an act, in the eyes of the leadership, would have surely meant ceding ground to the hostile outside world. Belorussia was precisely the kind of republic that could not be allowed the luxury of true autonomy. Its position between the Soviet heartland and Europe made it far too strategic for actual self-determination. Beyond the constraining circumstances of international relations, the Soviet Union inherited one other crucial political dynamic: the dominance of Russia and the Russian people across the entire post-Empire region. Obvious as it may seem, this particular birthmark played an important role in the creation of power structures among the new republics. Due to centuries of imperialist policies, Russia enjoyed a considerable preponderance on nearly every front in comparison to the smaller republics. Not only was it stronger militarily and economically, it also came into the post-revolution era with a substantially more developed national intellectual dialogue. This was especially evident in the Russian attitudes towards Belorussia and Ukraine, which were always treated as the little brothers who needed Russia's help and strength. Whereas other territories were only beginning to flesh out an official unifying identity at the turn of the century, Russia's was already well established. Moreover, it was established precisely along the important framework of supremacy over neighboring nationalities and ethnic groups. The Soviets were, of course, openly against Great Russian chauvinism, espousing an ideology of voluntary union among workers' republics. And yet, the tendency for integration of other republics into Russia proper were popular and supported by a number of key players, not least of which Stalin. However, regardless of incongruencies, Soviet nationality policy did have a single, long-term goal: the unification of all peoples under a single centralized socialist banner. This end goal was naturally opposed to the development of any real national identities, confirming that Soviet policy in this area could only ever be tenuous at best. The essence of Soviet nationality policy was characterized by a dialectical process in that it became a battleground of the old and the new, ideologically and materially. Russian imperialism clashed with Marxist-Leninist internationalism, interacting and fusing in peculiar ways to bring forth a synthesis that yielded a unique set of policies. On the one hand, they frequently imposed Russian supremacy over other groups. On the other hand, national identities were heavily promoted, and the Soviets gave various peoples the tools to formulate distinct national images. Belorussia's position in the Union quite clearly reflected this duality, with certain periods being dominated by one or the other mindset. For example, Rudling lays out 3 periods of Belarusiization: a period of heightened Belarusian identity in the 1920s, a brief push by Beria in 1953 that ended with Beria's death, and a final wave in Gorbachev's reform era. The first period was largely undone by later repressions that wiped out the Belarusian elite and put forward a strictly Russian-oriented political and social atmosphere. The second period proved too brief to be of any significance. By the third period, Belarusian identity had shifted distinctly away from an independence-oriented nationalism. Lubachko labels the 1920s NEP period as the golden age for Belarusian national identity. The NEP period was popular in Belorussia as it allowed the authorities to distribute land into private peasant hands. It also paved the way for discussions on returning Belarusian land back to the Republic from the RSFSR. Appeals from the Belarusians were met with agreement in the central government, resulting in the returning of substantial territories back to the BSSR. Additionally, during the NEP period, Belarusian authorities worked on expanding the accessibility and responsibilities of Soviets. Belarusians were at first hesitant to participate in elections and politics, but after some reforms to the electoral process, more and more people began to think of the word Soviet as a symbol of the right of the people to make decisions on local issues through discussions, consultations, and elections. Emphasis was placed on the representation of minorities in local government, though Belarusians, for the most part, themselves found proportional voices in the Soviets. These changes were part of a broader objective to focus on the economic development of the republic overall. Though the Communist Party of Belorussia was, at its inception, a predominantly Russian organization, filled mostly by soldiers and military officers, serious attempts were made to incorporate more of the Belarusian population into the party structure. By the end of the decade, the party had grown immensely, and the Belarusians made up a small majority in it. The central leadership's support for Belarusian nationalists and their goals allowed for the flourishing of Belarusian culture in the NEP period. Specialists across the country began to unearth the national history across a wide variety of disciplines. The success of restoring and elevating the Belarusian culture was so great that it convinced the members of the remotely functioning BNR to officially recognize Minsk as the legitimate capital of the Belarusian nation. The project of Belarusification became grounds for cooperation between nationalists and the communists. Efforts to bring back the Belarusian language into full vibrancy rested on literacy campaigns that swept the country with impressive force during the 1920s. Before the revolution, Belorussia had no institutions of higher education. By the end of the NEP period, there were 4 large, albeit underdeveloped, institutions in the country that became notable centers for scientific and intellectual discourse. This rapid change marked the beginning of an even larger expansion in educational facilities during the subsequent decades. By 1939, the total literacy rate in the BSSR was at 78.9%, up from 53.1% in 1926. The period of collectivization was particularly difficult for Belorussia. Though it had made some headway in terms of industrialization, most of its population was still peasantry. As a result, many were affected by forced collectivization. A large quantity of the kulaks who were deported to the east came from Belorussia. In the political purges that ran parallel to the economic changes, Belarusian nationalists were heavily targeted. Though the Bolsheviks had seemed eager to work with nationalists in the past, such deviations from party line were no longer accepted. Nationalism was seen as a threat that could easily invite foreign interests and disrupt socialist development. For Belorussia especially, the fear that nationalists had or would work with the Poles became a common justification for removing nationalists from positions of power and administration. The political repressions did not stop strictly at nationalist groups and individuals. Many pedagogues, writers, specialists, and leaders in the promotion of Belarusian culture were removed from their workplaces. This attack on the Belarusian elite was more aggressive and absolute than it was on the elites of other republics. Even within the Communist Party in Belorussia, there were many supporters of the NEP. Their subsequent opposition to the NEP's termination placed targets over their heads, leading to many expulsions, arrests, and deportations. Empty positions were filled by Russians, marking a turn back to Russification and Russian dominance. As a result, for the rest of the century, Russian dominated social, intellectual, and political spheres as the lingua franca. Though the vast majority spoke Belarusian, Russian was perceived by many as a second native language. In other words, the Belarusian language never fully recovered from the reversal of policies in the post-NEP period. The repression signaled a swing of the pendulum away from the potential union of workers' governments on equal footing. Instead of embracing Marxist-Leninist internationalism, Soviet leadership regressed into geopolitical realism at best, and Great Russian chauvinism at worst. The Belarusian experience in World War II was disproportionately traumatic, even by the standards of the Eastern Front. Much of the national character that developed in the post-war years revolved around the victory and heroism of the soldiers and partisans. This naturally created an overlap in the Belarusian identity and the notion of Homo Sovieticus at large. Belarusia's participation and sacrifice in World War II permanently connected it with the Soviet mythology in a way that other republics did not quite experience. One of the biggest changes for Belorussia occurred after World War II. Because the BSSR was no longer a borderland due to the rise of the Eastern Bloc, Soviet authorities decided to pursue a policy of rapid industrialization. This turned what was one of the least developed parts of the Union into the most industrialized republic by 1980. Belorussia carried this achievement all the way to the end of the Soviet Union, as suggested in a World Bank report released in the 1990s. When Belarus became independent in 1991, it was the richest of the 12 republics of the Commonwealth of Independent States in terms of per capita income, a status reflecting the republic's steady growth during the 1970s and early 1980s. It had developed an industrial sector that, in terms of share of total GDP, made it one of the most heavily industrialized countries in the world. The agricultural sector was modernized and came to depend not only on heavy equipment, much of which was manufactured in Belarus, but also on imported fuel and fertilizers. Though these changes improved living standards for the country, the urbanization of the population necessarily meant a process of Russification and a move away from traditional ties to the land. Even in an era of democratization, Belarusians were reluctant to rally around the nationalist banner. Without a nationalist wing of the Communist Party, Belorussia was the republic that most associated its identity with Sovietness. In the 1991 referendum, 82.7% of the population voted to preserve the Soviet Union, compared to the 76.4% average across the republics. The period from 1965 to 1980 has come to be known as the Masharau period. In this time, the BSSR was headed by a popular leader and veteran of the war, Pyotr Masharau. Masharau's time in office is remembered as one of political stability and economic prosperity, especially in relation to the other Soviet republics. Experts disagree on Masharau's relationship with Moscow, though there is some consensus that relations cooled by the end of Masharau's administration. Marples, as well as many others, label Masharau as an ardent communist who probably adhered to Leninist ideas far more than the party itself had by the second half of the 20th century. Regardless of his position in Moscow, Masharau remains a widely popular historical leader even today, associated both with his personal contributions in World War II and his leadership during Belarusia's era of stability. The final years of the Soviet Union brought with them two major events for Belorussia. One was the Chernobyl disaster, which disproportionately affected Belorussia, both in the context of the USSR and Europe. The other was Gorbachev's reformist policies, which brought back some cultural and linguistic freedom for the Belarusian people. Both events sparked considerable debate and drew some attention to the Belarusian national identity. Bids were even made by marginal nationalist groups to denounce the party altogether for its many shortcomings. However, groups like the Belarusian Popular Front were presented by the authorities as having clear connections to nationalist entities who collaborated to some degree or another with Nazi occupiers. In general, even the shocking events of the end of the Soviet Union were not able to jolt awake a functioning nationalist movement that was analogous to the movements gaining traction in neighboring republics. It could be argued that the dialectical process within the Soviet nationality policy in Belorussia resolved itself definitively in the camp of regression, the camp of Russian supremacy over the BSSR. And yet, what has emerged from Belorussia's Soviet experience is a unique identity that withstood a major geopolitical reorientation. Though the Soviet Union is now gone, many still describe Belarus and the Belarusian people as quintessentially Soviet. Titarenko's data shows that after a few years of Belarusian independence, in 1994, only 42% of Belarusians identified with the republic itself. 33% of the public considered their core personal identification as former Soviet Union, and 17% considered themselves citizens of the European or world community. The 33% who consider themselves Soviet are in and of themselves an interesting subject, worthy of a much deeper analysis than this video can provide. However, even the 17% of the respondents who consider themselves global citizens should pique the interest of the observer. Is this a kernel of Soviet internationalism? It is certainly not a distinctly Russian orientation, which could perhaps be said of the 33% of Soviet citizens. Despite heavy Russian influence and what appears to be strains of internationalism, Belarusian as a language is alive and well, albeit living side by side with Russian. The Belarusian national identity, however, seems far less developed. The question of Belarusian national identity brings us to the present-day crisis. Following the presidential elections in August of 2020, the country erupted into unprecedented civil unrest. Alexander Lukashenko, Belarus's president since the collapse of the USSR, secured another electoral victory, with official accounts reporting the incumbent at over 80% of the votes. There is little doubt that the opposition in Belarus never stood a real chance in the electoral process. Indeed, nothing about the outcome of the recent election has been a surprise. Why then did the country suddenly become engulfed in the flames of civil resistance? The answer very evidently brings us back to the question of Belarusian national identity. The identity that emerged from the Soviet era is demonstrating its inherent instability, and suggesting that perhaps there was no resolution in the contradictions that scarred Belarusian history. At the heart of the crisis is the question of where Belarus belongs, and who the Belarusian people are. Though Belarus spent much of its post-Soviet years tied very closely to its large eastern neighbor, who supplied the country with critical natural resources, the question of how close Belarus should be to Russia is once again emerging. In the late 1990s, Belarus signed the so-called Union State Treaty with Russia, a document demonstrating intent for close political, economic, and social integration. The basis of the treaty rested on the assumption that both countries were entering into an equal partnership, one in which Belarus and Russia dictated the terms of union eye to eye. Unsurprisingly, Moscow never saw it this way. Instead, the Kremlin continued to demand more political concessions from Minsk, in a fashion that revealed its imperialist aspirations. Belarus has been similarly hesitant to accept terms without pushing forward its own political objectives. But the power dynamic has always been dictated by Russia's military preponderance and its unmatched subsidization of natural resource exports to Minsk. It is this dependence that has left an uneasy air in Belarus, expressed even by Lukashenko himself in the past years. The solution to this dilemma is far from reach. Belarus is standing at a crossroads with many dangerous paths ahead. The path towards continuing warm relations with Russia is rife with dependency and capitulation to Moscow's demands. The path towards Europe and the West presents a similar complication and leaves open the possibility of a serious civil conflict, as it is unlikely that Putin would allow Russia's last ally to turn towards NATO and the EU. Here we could encounter an outcome chillingly similar to the ongoing war in Ukraine. The problem, of course, is that Belarus is not Ukraine. Despite being a stagnant and politically closed society, it is among the most stable of the former Soviet republics, with low levels of inequality and high levels of economic development. A conflict on Russia's border would be the second most preferable scenario for the West. The US and NATO have been working hard to destroy the vestiges of Russian political influence in Eastern Europe, encroaching further and further into a part of the world that Moscow has considered theirs for centuries. Its geographic and geopolitical position makes Belarus an inviting target for both sides. And so, on the one hand, the decision between East, West, or somewhere in the middle is one Belarus must make itself, and one that is long overdue. On the other hand, the decision will be largely insignificant. Belarus, like its other Eastern European neighbors, is caught between the interests and influences of two massive nexuses of power. Much like Ukraine, it could easily become victim of another imperialist proxy war. The double threat of foreign domination then opens the gates to a third threat, a less than adequate status quo that justifies its own existence by demonstrating the dangers of both the East and the West. Caught between all three nightmares, the Belarusian people will remain in chains until they liberate themselves from both domestic and foreign capital. As we continue to observe the unfolding situation in Belarus, we should keep in mind key theoretical structures to assist our analysis. The Belarusian crisis is an overdetermined moment, in which multiple contradictions have coalesced and escalated into an open antagonism. These contradictions are spatially and temporally diverse, between the historical question of Belarusian national identity and the geopolitical maneuverings of Russia and the West. The overdetermined moment can only be understood in understanding the social strands that produced it. Moreover, the moment demonstrates the ways in which a smaller contradiction constitutes and is constituted by larger contradictions. Only an analytical framework informed by the materialist dialectic can lay bare the realities that turned the unsurprising outcome of a routinely predetermined election into a geopolitically pivotal moment.